John Wayne was shaking hands with reporters at the True Grit premiere when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, turned his back on 500 cameras, and walked away from the most important night of his career. What he saw hidden behind the crowd that December night in 1969 would silence every reporter in Hollywood and change one man's life forever. It was December 18, 1969, at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, California. The premiere of True Grit wasn't just another movie opening. At 62 years old, after 4 decades in Hollywood, John Wayne had finally been nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actor. This was his redemption story, his validation, the role that proved he wasn't just an action star but a real actor. Every major entertainment outlet in America had sent their top reporters. Henry Fonda stood near the entrance, chatting with Katharine Hepburn. Frank Sinatra had flown in from Las Vegas just to support his friend Duke. The red carpet stretched 250 feet down Hollywood Boulevard, lined with photographers fighting for position, entertainment reporters shouting questions, and thousands of fans pressed against metal barriers hoping to catch a glimpse of the American legend. John Wayne had been working that carpet for nearly an hour. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo with his signature bolo tie, that weathered face somehow looking both tough as leather and warm as sunshine. He'd been stopping for interviews, posing for photos, laughing with old friends, soaking in what might be the peak moment of his entire career. But what nobody at that glittering premiere knew was that behind those barriers, pushed all the way to the back where security had told him to wait and not cause problems, sat a 58-year-old man in a wheelchair who had been there since 2 in the afternoon. His name was Robert Mitchell. The Korean War had taken both his legs in 1951. The 18 years since had taken almost everything else. But what Robert was about to witness would prove that sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the ones we see on screen, they're the ones who remember to look past the spotlight. Robert Mitchell was 58 years old but looked 75. Korea had claimed his legs during the Battle of Bloody Ridge when a mortar shell landed 3 feet from his foxhole. The surgeons at the MASH unit had saved his life but couldn't save what was left below his knees. The war had taken his legs. The years after had taken everything else. His wife Margaret had tried for 6 years, but watching your husband drink himself unconscious every night while phantom pains made him scream in his sleep eventually breaks even the strongest love. She'd left in 1957, taking their daughter Sarah to Oregon. His job at the Douglas aircraft factory had disappeared when they realized a man in a wheelchair couldn't work an assembly line. His small house in Burbank had been foreclosed on in 1963. Now Robert lived in a shared room at the Veterans Affairs facility in West Los Angeles, a cramped space with 3 other broken men, surviving on a disability check of $187 a month that barely covered his medications for the pain that never stopped, the infections that never fully healed, and the nightmares that never went away. But Robert Mitchell had one thing that kept him breathing: John Wayne movies. Specifically, war movies and westerns about damaged men who found a way to keep their dignity when everything else was gone. He'd seen The Sands of Iwo Jima 17 times. He'd watched The Searchers so many times he could recite every line. These weren't just movies to Robert. They were proof that men could suffer and still stand tall, could lose everything and still matter. True Grit was about an aging U.S. Marshal named Rooster Cogburn, a one-eyed drunk haunted by his past, who gets one last chance to prove he's more than a broken-down failure. When Robert had read the reviews, when he'd watched the trailers, when he'd heard John Wayne's voice growl about a man with true grit, he'd seen himself in every frame. This movie wasn't entertainment for Robert Mitchell. It was a mirror reflecting back the man he used to be and the man he desperately hoped he could still become. His daughter Sarah was the only person who understood what John Wayne meant to her father, and she was about to make a sacrifice that would change both their lives forever. Sarah Mitchell was 31 years old, working double shifts as a nurse at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, and she hadn't spoken to her father in 12 years. Her mother had made sure of that after the divorce, moving them to Portland and telling Sarah that her father had chosen alcohol over his family. But 3 months ago, Sarah had gotten a letter from the VA facility. Her father had listed her as his emergency contact, and they thought she should know his health was declining rapidly. Against every instinct, against her mother's angry protests, Sarah had driven down from Portland to visit him. What she'd found was a man who'd stopped drinking 8 years earlier, who volunteered at the VA helping other veterans fill out disability paperwork, who kept a small photo of her as a child next to his bed, and who cried when he saw her walk through the door. They'd spent hours talking. And she'd learned about the John Wayne movies, about how they'd kept him alive during the darkest years, about True Grit and what it meant to him. Sarah had saved every extra dollar from her nursing shifts for 3 months. She'd found a company that rented wheelchair-accessible vans for $150 a day. She'd driven her father 8 hours from Portland to Los Angeles, arriving at Grauman's Chinese Theater at exactly 2 p.m. for an 8 p.m. premiere. She knew they couldn't get inside. Premiere tickets were invitation only, reserved for industry executives and press credentials. But she thought maybe, just maybe, if they waited by the barriers, her father could see John Wayne walk past. Just once. Just for 10 seconds. After 18 years of pain and loss and feeling invisible, maybe her father could have one moment of being close to the man whose voice had kept him company through 1,000 sleepless nights. Security had initially ordered them to leave. The area was restricted to credentialed press only. Sarah had begged, her voice breaking. She'd explained about Korea, about her father's legs, about what John Wayne meant to him. A sympathetic security guard named Martinez had finally relented, letting them stay in the very back, behind everyone else, where they wouldn't be in the way. From where they were positioned, Robert couldn't see anything. The crowd was too thick, too loud, too alive with energy. His wheelchair sat too low. But he could hear the shouting getting louder. He could see the camera flashes getting brighter. He could feel something important happening just 60 feet away. "Is he here yet, Sarah?" Robert kept asking, his voice tight with hope. "Not yet, Dad," Sarah would answer, standing on her toes, checking her phone for updates. "Soon. I promise. Soon." At 7:52 p.m., the crowd exploded into chaos. Through the wall of people, Sarah caught a glimpse of that unmistakable figure, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the confident stride of a man who'd walked 1,000 red carpets and owned every single one. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice cracking, tears already forming. "He's here. Duke's here." Robert tried desperately to crane his neck, tried to see through the impossible wall of reporters and photographers and fans blocking his view. All he could see were flashes of movement, the backs of heads, the glow of lights that might as well have been a million miles away. "Can you see him, sweetheart?" Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah stood on her absolute tiptoes, holding her small camera above her head, trying to get any kind of view. "He's so far away, Dad. There are too many people. I'm so sorry." Robert Mitchell had survived a mortar blast that should have killed him. He'd endured 17 surgeries to save what was left of his legs. He'd lived through 40 years of phantom pains that felt like his missing feet were being crushed in a vice. He'd survived the loss of his wife, his daughter, his home, his dignity. But sitting there, 60 feet away from the man whose movies had literally kept him alive, and not being able to see him, that felt like the final, crushing defeat. A single tear ran down Robert's weathered, scarred face. Sarah saw it and felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought we could." "It's okay, baby girl," Robert said quietly, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "It's okay. At least we tried. At least you tried. That's more than I deserved." But what neither Robert nor Sarah knew was that at that exact moment, John Wayne was about to do something that would stop 500 reporters mid-question and prove that real courage has nothing to do with what happens on a movie screen. At that exact moment, John Wayne was standing under the bright lights in the middle of the red carpet, being interviewed by a reporter from The Hollywood Reporter. The reporter was asking him about Rooster Cogburn's character arc, about redemption, about what it meant to play a broken man who finds one last chance to prove his worth. John Wayne was giving a thoughtful answer, his distinctive drawl carrying across the crowd. "Well, I think Rooster represents every man who's ever felt like life wrote him off too early," Wayne was saying. "He's got nothing left but his pride and his word, and the movie's about whether that's enough too." And then John Wayne stopped mid-sentence. Over the reporter's shoulder, through a gap in the crowd, he saw something that hit him like a punch to the chest. A wheelchair. Way in the back. Behind all the barriers. Behind all the important people. A man in that wheelchair, wearing what looked like an old military jacket, his face turned away, his shoulders shaking in a way that could only mean one thing. He was crying. John Wayne had played soldiers and cowboys and tough guys for 40 years. He'd directed films about war and honor and hard men facing impossible choices. He'd met presidents and generals and Hollywood legends. But there was something about seeing that veteran in a wheelchair, alone in a crowd of thousands, pushed to the back where nobody had to look at him, that reached past every tough guy persona John Wayne had ever worn and grabbed something raw and real inside his chest. Wayne's own father had been a pharmacist who'd lost everything in the Great Depression. Wayne himself had grown up poor, had worked as a prop boy, had clawed his way up from nothing. He'd spent years being told he was just a cowboy actor, not a real performer. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to have people look right through you like you didn't matter. "Excuse me," John Wayne said to the reporter, not waiting for a response, not caring about the camera still rolling. He turned away from the lights. Away from the interview. Away from the 500 reporters who'd been fighting for his attention all night. Away from the premiere that was supposed to be his crowning moment. He walked directly toward the metal barriers, toward the back of the crowd, toward the man in the wheelchair. The crowd parted in confusion. Reporters exchanged bewildered looks. Frank Sinatra, watching from the VIP section near the theater entrance, leaned forward with sudden interest, a slight smile forming on his face. Security guards instinctively moved to intercept Wayne, thinking there was some kind of threat, some kind of problem. "It's fine," Wayne said, his voice carrying that unmistakable authority that had commanded respect in 100 films. "Let me through." The guards backed off immediately. You didn't argue with John Wayne. He reached the barrier where Robert and Sarah stood frozen in shock. The people around them suddenly realized what was happening and erupted in shouting. Cameras swiveled. Reporters started sprinting across the red carpet. But John Wayne's attention was focused entirely on the man in the wheelchair whose face was still turned away, whose daughter stood beside him with an expression of pure, stunned disbelief. "Sir," John Wayne said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through paper. "You're a veteran, aren't you?" Robert Mitchell slowly turned his head, not quite believing what he was hearing, not quite able to process that the voice he'd heard in his head for 20 years was now speaking directly to him. When Robert saw John Wayne standing 3 feet away, looking directly at him with those famous eyes that had stared down outlaws and enemies and death itself, his mouth opened but no sound came out. "Korea?" John Wayne asked gently. Robert managed to nod, still unable to speak. John Wayne looked at the metal barriers separating them, looked at the security guards, looked at the absurdity of bars keeping him from this man who'd given his legs for his country. Then John Wayne did something that would be replayed on news broadcasts for weeks and photographed from a dozen angles and talked about in Hollywood for decades. He placed both hands on top of the barrier and vaulted over it with surprising grace for a 62-year-old man, landing on the other side in his $800 tuxedo, and knelt down beside Robert Mitchell's wheelchair. The crowd gasped. Cameras exploded in flashes. Paramount executives started frantically talking into their headsets. Entertainment reporters started shoving each other to get closer. John Wayne ignored all of it. "What's your name, son?" Wayne asked, putting his large hand on Robert's shoulder. "Robert," the veteran managed to whisper, his voice breaking. "Robert Mitchell. 2nd Infantry Division. Battle of Bloody Ridge." "Robert," John Wayne repeated, his own voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for your service. Truly. Thank you." And Robert Mitchell, who hadn't cried in front of another human being in 18 years, broke down completely. Deep, shaking sobs that came from a place so deep he'd forgotten it existed. But John Wayne wasn't done, and what he was about to demand from Hollywood's most powerful executives would prove that some men don't just play heroes, they are heroes. Sarah knelt beside her father, tears streaming down her face, one hand on his shoulder, the other covering her mouth in shock. "Mr. Wayne," Sarah managed to say through her tears, "you have no idea what this means. Your movies, they've kept my father alive. After Korea, after he lost his legs, after he lost everything, your films gave him something to hold on to. True grit, what it means to him, you can't." "I think I understand," John Wayne said quietly, his hand still on Robert's shoulder, his eyes never leaving the veteran's face. Robert was trying to speak, trying to thank him, but all that came out were broken sounds between sobs. That's when David Weisbart, head of production for Paramount Pictures, pushed through the crowd to the barrier, his face flushed red, his expensive suit rumpled from shoving past reporters. "Duke," David said, his voice tight with stress, "we need you back on the carpet. The schedule is completely falling apart. Every camera is pointed at, we need to start the screening. We have 800 people waiting inside. The press is..." John Wayne turned his head slowly to look at David Weisbart. It was the same look he'd given countless outlaws in countless westerns, the look that said the conversation was over before it started. "David," Wayne said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we're delaying the start." "What? Duke, we can't just..." "We're delaying the start," Wayne repeated, each word deliberate and final. "Because Robert here is going to watch this movie tonight. He's going to watch it from the front row. And I'm going to sit right next to him. Do we understand each other?" David Weisbart had worked with John Wayne on 3 films. He'd learned that when Duke used that tone, when his jaw set in that particular way, arguing was pointless. Wayne wasn't making a request. He was stating a fact. David nodded, already pulling out his phone. "Also," Wayne continued, standing up and putting both hands on the handles of Robert's wheelchair, "I need you to find out what VA facility Robert lives in. I need you to find out what his situation is. His medical care. His housing. Everything. Can you do that?" David looked at Sarah, who was now crying so hard she could barely stand. He looked at Robert, who was staring up at John Wayne like he was looking at the face of God. "Yes, Duke," David said quietly. "I can do that." "Good man," Wayne said, and there was something in his voice that made it sound like the highest praise anyone could receive. John Wayne gripped the handles of Robert's wheelchair firmly. "You ready to watch a movie, Robert?" Wayne asked. Robert nodded, still unable to speak, tears still streaming down his face. "Then let's go," Wayne said. "You've waited long enough." What happened next would become one of the most iconic moments in Hollywood history, captured by dozens of cameras and witnessed by the biggest stars in America. John Wayne didn't just get Robert Mitchell a seat in the theater. He personally pushed the wheelchair up that 250-foot red carpet, moving slowly, deliberately, while every camera in Hollywood captured the moment. They passed photographers who had stopped taking pictures, too stunned to do anything but stare. They passed reporters who had stopped shouting questions, their mouths hanging open in silence. They passed Frank Sinatra, who started clapping slowly, his blue eyes shining with something that might have been tears. They passed Henry Fonda, who removed his hat and held it over his heart. They passed Katharine Hepburn, who wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Sarah walked beside her father, one hand on the wheelchair, still unable to fully process that this was real, that this was actually happening. Paramount executives scrambled to rearrange the front row seating, moving studio executives and press to make room. When they reached the theater entrance, John Wayne stopped. He turned to face the crowd of celebrities and press, his hands still on Robert's wheelchair. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wayne said, his voice carrying that unmistakable drawl across the suddenly silent crowd. "This is Robert Mitchell. He served in Korea with the 2nd Infantry Division at Bloody Ridge. He gave his legs for this country. He's seen things none of us have seen. Sacrificed things none of us can imagine. And tonight, he's watching this movie from the front row, because if anyone deserves to see a story about a man with true grit, it's a man who's lived it for 18 years. The premiere audience, Hollywood's toughest, most jaded crowd, erupted in applause. But it wasn't the polite, obligatory applause of a premiere. People were standing. Some were openly crying. It was real, raw, genuine emotion from people who'd thought they'd seen everything. John Wayne pushed Robert's wheelchair into the theater, positioned it in the front row center section, and sat in the seat directly next to him. Sarah sat on Robert's other side. "You ready?" Wayne asked quietly. "I don't know what to say," Robert whispered. "Then don't say anything," Wayne replied. "Just watch the movie." But the premiere was just the beginning of a story that would span 7 years and change thousands of lives. For the next 2 hours and 8 minutes, John Wayne sat in that theater watching a movie he'd lived with for a year, but his attention was mostly on Robert Mitchell's face. He watched the veteran flinch during the gunfight scenes. He watched him nod during Rooster Cogburn's speeches about a man's word being all he has left. He watched him cry during the final redemption sequence. When the credits rolled and the theater erupted in applause, Robert wasn't clapping. He was staring at the screen, processing something deeper than entertainment. Wayne turned to him. "What did you think?" Robert looked at Wayne with red, swollen eyes. "That was me up there. That was my whole life. The anger. The feeling like the world moved on and left me behind. But the ending," his voice broke, "the ending gave me something I forgot I could have." "What's that, Robert?" "Hope," Robert whispered. "Hope that it's not too late. That I can still matter." John Wayne's jaw tightened with emotion. "Robert, you've always mattered. Some of us just needed a reminder to notice." After the screening, at the after-party Wayne attended for exactly 15 minutes, he pulled David Weisbart aside. "Find out everything about Robert's situation," Wayne said quietly. "Medical bills, housing, everything. I want you to quietly establish a fund that covers whatever gaps exist. Don't make it public. Don't make it a press release. Just make sure he has what he needs." "How much are we talking about, Duke?" "Whatever it takes," Wayne replied. "And David, find out about other veterans in similar situations. I want to know how many Robert Mitchells are out there who can't even make it to a movie premiere." Over the next 3 months, John Wayne worked with the VA and veterans organizations to identify men falling through the cracks, those with inadequate medical care, housing insecurity, social isolation. He quietly funded a program that provided assistance to veterans in the Los Angeles area. Robert Mitchell was the first beneficiary, but he was far from the last. Wayne arranged for Robert to move from the shared VA facility to a small accessible apartment in Burbank. He covered the costs of medical treatments Robert's benefits didn't address. He even got Robert a consulting position on a documentary about Korean War veterans Wayne was producing. But more importantly, John Wayne visited Robert regularly over the next 7 years. Not with cameras. Not with press releases. Just quiet visits where 2 men, one who'd played soldiers, one who'd been one, could talk about sacrifice, survival, and what it means to find purpose after trauma. Robert Mitchell lived until 1976. During those 7 years, he reconnected with his daughter Sarah, became a volunteer coordinator at the West LA VA facility, and told everyone who would listen about the night John Wayne reminded him he still had value. When Robert passed away, John Wayne attended the funeral. In his eulogy, he said, "Robert taught me that movies only matter if they help us see real people more clearly. Rooster Cogburn found redemption in a script I acted. Robert found it in the life he lived after we met. Only one of those stories matters." The Veterans Assistance Program John Wayne quietly established after meeting Robert has helped over 4,200 veterans in Southern California. It's funded through residuals from True Grit and Wayne's other films. The program's unofficial motto, never publicized but known to everyone who works there, is, "Nobody waits in the back." In 1977, a small plaque was installed at Grauman's Chinese Theater near where premieres are held. It reads, "In memory of Robert Mitchell, U.S. Army, and all veterans who reminded us to look past the spotlight. December 18, 1969. The story of that premiere reminds us that real heroism isn't about the roles we play on screen. Sometimes it's about the moment we stop performing and start seeing the people we've been too busy to notice." John Wayne could have finished his interview, walked into his premiere, and enjoyed his career-defining night. Nobody would have blamed him. He'd earned it. Instead, he saw a veteran crying in a wheelchair and made a choice that cost him nothing but time and meant everything to a man who'd been invisible for too long. True Grit won John Wayne his only Academy Award. The film made over $68 million. It's considered one of his finest performances. But if you ask anyone who knew John Wayne about his proudest moment from that movie, they'll tell you about a premiere that started 40 minutes late because he refused to let another veteran wait in the back. If this story moved you, I hope you'll subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember that true character shows up in how we treat people who can't do anything for us in return. By the way, where in the world are you watching this video from? Drop your city or country in the comments, I'd love to know this story reached you. Have you ever witnessed someone stop their important moment to help someone invisible? Share your story below. And hit that notification bell for more true stories about legends who understood that humanity matters more than Hollywood.